The morning of August 31st, 1983, broke over Pojuca with a deceptive, heavy stillness. The air held the sharp scent of morning dew and the faint, grounding aroma of roasting coffee. For the 6,000 residents, it was merely another Thursday. The streets were quiet, the town caught in the slow rhythm of a day just beginning to stir. At 6:50 a.m., the Steel Serpent arrived. It was a colossal freight train, a massive chain of 22 tank cars, pulled by a diesel-electric engine. It did not belong to the town. It was a transient beast, a heavy industrial pulse, cutting through the quiet heart of Bahia. The locomotive groaned under the weight of its burden, hauling thousands of liters of fuel destined for the refineries in the north. 5 of the cars were swollen with gasoline. 17 more carried heavy diesel oil. The train moved with a relentless, mechanical indifference, its shadow stretching long across the tracks and into the backyards. The metal wheels clicked against the iron rails, a steady, ominous beat that drowned out the morning birds. It was a heavy, dangerous passage. At kilometer 82, the earth beneath the tracks shuddered. It was not a tremor of the ground, but a failure of the iron. The rails, worn thin by years of neglect, finally gave way under the massive weight of the freight train. A high-pitched, agonizing screech of tortured metal ripped through the morning air as the train's momentum turned against it. 3 of the tank cars, each weighing 80 tons, buckled violently. They twisted into grotesque, jagged shapes, snapping off the line like toys crushed by a giant hand. 126,000 liters of gasoline surged from the ruptured tanks. The fuel did not pool. It cascaded down the railway embankment like a dark, shimmering waterfall. It moved with a terrifying liquid speed, snaking through the town's drainage ditches and spilling into the backyards of Rua da Piedade. The air grew heavy with the fumes, a silent, invisible warning that the entire community was now a ticking, flammable trap, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite the catastrophe. The initial silence following the crash did not last. News of the derailment traveled through Pojuca like a spark through dry grass. Doors swung open. People stepped into the streets, their initial hesitation dissolving as they saw the shimmering, dark liquid pooling in the gutters. The smell was overwhelming, a sharp, chemical sting that burned the nostrils, yet no one turned away. Instead, a strange, frantic energy took hold. From backyards and kitchens, the tools of the harvest appeared. Plastic buckets, metal basins, empty soda cans, and heavy gas cylinders were dragged toward the railway. Neighbors called to neighbors, pointing at the flowing stream with wide, excited eyes. They did not see a disaster. They saw a windfall. Men and women waded into the runoff, their hands and feet slick with the volatile liquid. They scooped the gasoline into their containers, sloshing it over the sides. "Good gasoline!" someone shouted, the voice cutting through the humid morning air. The cry was met with nods and eager, desperate grins. The community was no longer a town of 6,000. It was a collective of collectors, blind to the danger, their focus narrowed entirely to the liquid gold. Hours passed, yet the chaos on Rua da Piedade only intensified. The authorities remained absent, leaving the town to manage the spreading fuel on its own. When a small contingent of police finally arrived, they were met not with fear, but with a wall of defiance. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, hands raised, shouting for the crowd to disperse, but their voices were swallowed by the noise of clanking metal and the frantic shuffling of feet. There were simply too many people, and the lure of the fuel was too strong. The police were forced to retreat to the perimeter, their presence reduced to a mere suggestion of order that no one followed. It was not until much later that employees from RFFSA and Petrobras appeared, moving with a heavy, agonizing slowness that defied the urgency of the situation. They walked through the spill, checking gauges and inspecting the buckled tracks, their faces etched with a detached professional calm. They began the process of uncoupling the remaining cars and siphoning off what fuel they could, but their efforts were localized and ineffective. They did not cordon off the area. The site remained wide open, a public thoroughfare for anyone with a bucket or a dream of profit. The town was left to its own devices, a ticking time bomb. Daylight bled from the sky, leaving Pojuca in a bruised violet twilight. The frantic activity of the morning had finally ebbed, replaced by a heavy, unnatural stillness. 14 hours had passed since the derailment, and the town was now a sealed chamber. The gasoline had seeped deep into the porous earth, under floorboards, and into the very walls of the homes lining Rua da Piedade. As the evening air cooled, it did not dissipate the fumes. It trapped them. The vapor hung low, thick and oily, clinging to the lungs of anyone who dared to breathe deeply. Inside the houses, the air was dense enough to taste. It was a suffocating chemical blanket that settled over the furniture, the bedding, and the sleeping children. Outside, the streetlights flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows over the pools of fuel that still glistened in the dark. The silence was absolute. No birds sang. No wind stirred the trees. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a collapse. Somewhere in the darkness, a stray dog trotted through the spill, its paws splashing rhythmically against the pavement, the only sound for miles. The town was a powder keg, its fuse lit by the invisible, rising concentration of gas. Every house was a vessel of potential energy. At 8:30 in the evening, the silence shattered. It did not fade. It was ripped apart by a sound that vibrated through the very foundation of the earth. A single spark, perhaps a stray current from a wall socket, or the flick of a lighter, found the heavy, invisible cloud of vapor. The detonation was instantaneous. 3 of the massive tank cars detonated in a synchronized roar, their steel shells twisting like paper in a furnace. The liquid fire did not just burn, it flowed. The blast wave leveled the immediate surroundings, snapping power poles and tearing roof tiles from their rafters. A colossal fireball erupted from the center of Rua da Piedade, a wall of orange and white heat that slammed into the night sky. A molten liquid wave of gasoline surged forward, hungry and unstoppable, pouring into the doorways of 13 homes. The structures did not stand a chance. The heat was so intense it warped the metal of nearby vehicles and scorched the leaves of trees 100 yards away. The street was now a river of liquid fire. The silence that followed the blast was short-lived, replaced by a chorus of agony that rose from the ruins of Rua da Piedade. Figures stumbled out of the wall of flame, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were no longer recognizable as neighbors or friends. They were charred silhouettes, skin sloughing away in the heat. Some collapsed within feet of their front doors, their limbs twitching as the fire continued to feed on the fuel-soaked ground. Others ran blindly, their arms outstretched, screams tearing through the night air, a high, thin sound that refused to stop. The stench was overwhelming, a thick, cloying odor of burning flesh that cut through the sharp chemical reek of gasoline. It clung to the back of the throat, impossible to ignore. Survivors with burns across their entire bodies crawled toward the darkness beyond the light, leaving trails of soot and blood on the pavement. There was no order, no rescue, only the frantic, desperate struggle to escape the heat. A man collapsed in the middle of the street, his back a mass of blackened tissue, his voice reduced to a dry, rattling rasp. Nearby, a woman stood motionless. Desperate trucks, cruisers, buses crammed with the dying, their seats soaked in blood and fluid. They sped toward Salvador, 70 kilometers away, leaving the burning town behind. The railway tracks still run through the town, a constant, metallic reminder of the systemic failure that turned a quiet morning into a furnace. 11 hospitals received the influx, but the system buckled instantly. At the Getulio Vargas Hospital, corridors became wards, and the triage area overflowed into the parking lot. Doctors worked without pause, their hands stained with soot and antiseptic. Bodies arrived in waves, many burned beyond any hope of visual identification. As the sun climbed over the horizon, the smoke finally thinned, revealing the true scale of the ruin. The final count was not a matter of speculation anymore. 36 people were dead by dawn, but the number climbed relentlessly over the following days as the critically injured succumbed to their wounds. 99 lives were extinguished in total. The aftermath brought no closure, only a long, hollow silence in the courts. Accusations of negligence against the railway authority and local officials circulated for years, but the legal machinery ground to a halt. The tragedy of the death train was not an accident. It was a consequence of neglect that the country chose to ignore. In 1994, the case was shelved. No one served a single day in prison for the 99 lives lost. Families received compensation, but the sums were thin. failing to bridge the gap between their shattered lives and the reality of their loss. The physical scars on the survivors, the tight, pulled skin and the restricted movement, serve as a daily, living record of that night. Pojuca remained a town marked by the disaster. Every August 31st, the streets go quiet. The town observes a municipal holiday, not for celebration, but for a somber collective remembrance. Residents gather to lay flowers and hold vigils, keeping the names of the dead from fading into the background of history. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, rattling the foundations of the nearby cemetery. Then came the sound of rushing liquid. Pojuca remembers. Brazil must not forget. Their lives, their pain, and their absence are a permanent plea for accountability.